Living in the middle of the woods, I grew up surrounded by towering trees, thick underbrush, and the sounds of nature stretching endlessly in every direction. My house sat on a large patch of cleared land, but beyond that, it was nothing but forest, rolling hills, and winding trails that led deeper into the unknown. It was the perfect place for kids to run wild, and with a group of friends, we spent countless nights outside, setting up makeshift camps, building forts, and playing games long after the sun had disappeared behind the trees. One of our favorite games was something we called Manhunt. It was basically a mix between hide and seek and tag, but we played it under the cover of darkness. The rules were simple. One person was the hunter, armed with a flashlight, and the rest of us scattered into the woods to find the best hiding spots we could. The hunter's job was to track us down and shine their light on us to catch us. We never used phones or walkie-talkies, just the dark woods, our own instincts, and the thrill of the game. We played this game often, and every time it felt like an adventure. Some nights, the air would be thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth filling our lungs as we crouched behind trees, listening for the hunter's footsteps. Other nights, the wind would cut through the forest, rustling the branches and making it hard to tell if someone was moving nearby or if it was just nature itself shifting in the dark. One particular night stands out more than the rest. It was late summer, warm but not unbearable, with the moon high overhead, casting just enough light to navigate the forest without a flashlight. The cicadas were screaming in the distance, their droning calls broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of something moving through the undergrowth. It was perfect weather for a game of manhunt. We had all gathered near the edge of the woods, right where the tree line started to swallow up the open yard of my house. Our hunter for the night, Jackson, counted down while the rest of us took off, running in different directions into the darkness. I was hiding with two others, crouched low behind a fallen log deep in the woods. The bark was rough beneath my palms, and the earthy scent of decaying leaves filled my nose as I pressed myself as low as possible. We were far enough that the house was barely visible through the trees, just a few specks of yellow light filtering through the gaps in the branches. Jackson's flashlight flickered in the distance, sweeping back and forth as he searched for us. His footsteps were soft, almost muffled by the thick layer of leaves covering the ground, but we could hear them when everything else went still. My heart was pounding, the excitement of the game mixing with the eerie stillness of the woods. And then, something changed. The flashlight wasn't moving anymore. It had stopped completely, the beam pointed at the ground. At first, I thought Jackson was just listening for movement, but then I realized the light was much too far away. It was in the opposite direction from where we had started, away from the house, deeper into the woods. A second later, I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves behind us. It wasn't coming from where Jackson was. It was behind us, somewhere in the trees. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone trying to step lightly, but unable to avoid the dry leaves scattered across the forest floor. I went completely still, barely breathing. The others beside me must have heard it too because no one moved. We just stayed there, listening. Another step, closer this time. The flashlight from Jackson's direction flickered again, still unmoving, still too far away to be him. My stomach tightened. Someone else was in the woods with us. One of the others beside me shifted slightly, barely making a sound. But at that moment, the leaves crunched again, this time faster, like whoever was out there had picked up their pace. That was it. We bolted. All three of us shot up from behind the log, kicking up leaves and dirt as we took off running toward the house. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the footsteps breaking into a sprint behind us, crashing through the underbrush, twigs snapping, something or someone moving fast. My lungs burned as I ran, my arms pumping, feet barely touching the ground. The only thought in my head was getting back to the yard, to the house, to where the porch lights would cut through the dark. We burst out of the trees, feet hitting the grass, gasping for air as we stumbled toward the porch. The second we crossed into the light, I turned back. Nothing. The woods were dark, silent except for the distant hum of insects. The trees stood still, the underbrush unmoving. It was as if nothing had happened, as if whatever had been there had melted back into the forest the second we had left the cover of the trees. Jackson came jogging up a moment later, confused and out of breath. He had been searching in a completely different area and had no idea what had just happened. We never found out who or what had been in the woods with us that night. It could have been a hunter, a lost hiker, maybe just some unlucky guy who stumbled into a group of kids playing a game in the dark. Maybe they had been just as scared as we were when we suddenly jumped up and ran screaming back to the house. We kept playing manhunt after that night, but I was never able to shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just the paranoia of being alone in the woods at night. But every time I crouched behind a tree or ducked into the underbrush, I couldn't help but listen just a little more carefully, straining to hear something moving in the darkness. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, the woods are never as empty as they seem. The air was cool as I stepped outside, the scent of damp soil and old leaves filling my lungs. The sky above was dark, clouds drifting slowly across the moon, casting faint shifting shadows over the fields. Our farm was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant bleating of sheep in the lower pasture. My brother had just come back from the woods, breathless and frantic, telling me that Chester was gone. He didn't stop to let me ask questions, just blurted out that his phone had died. A beam of light had flashed at his feet, and suddenly, the dog was nowhere to be found. It didn't make sense, but the urgency in his voice made it clear. Something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the woods. The trees began barely 15 meters from our front door, the boundary between our land and the dense woodland that stretched for miles beyond. Chester had grown up here, ran these paths his entire life, chasing rabbits, rolling in the mud, and coming home only when he was tired. The thought of him lost or hurt made my stomach tighten. As I stepped past the first row of trees, the air changed. It always felt different in the woods at night, but this was something else. Heavier, thicker. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path my brother must have taken. The undergrowth on either side was dense, brambles and ferns creeping toward the trail. The wind barely stirred the branches above. I walked further, calling Chester's name, listening between each call for any sound. Movement, panting, the jingle of his collar. The only response was the distant hoot of an owl. Then, just ahead, something shifted. I stopped, heart pounding, straining my eyes in the dark. The flashlight caught movement behind a thick tree. I took a few cautious steps forward, angling the beam. Chester. He was just standing there, half hidden behind the trunk. At first, I felt relief, but as I got closer, it faded into something colder. He wasn't running toward me, tail wagging like he always did when I came to find him. He wasn't whining in excitement or bouncing on his paws, ready to bolt home. He was still, unnaturally still. His tail was tucked tight between his legs, his ears pinned back. His entire body was stiff, legs locked, like he was trying to make himself smaller. Chester. I called again, my voice quieter now. He didn't react, just stood there. The beam of my flashlight reflected in his eyes, making them shine eerily in the dark. He blinked once, slow. Then, without a sound, he stepped forward, but not toward me. He walked past me, slow and deliberate, his paws barely making a sound against the leaf-covered ground. It was like he didn't recognize me, or if he did, he didn't care. I turned, following him with the flashlight as he walked straight out of the trees, back toward the house. His pace never changed, slow and careful, like he was walking on ice. Every few steps, his ears flicked, but he never looked back. I stayed close behind, scanning the trees, the trail, the shadows. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I couldn't hear anything, but the silence was too complete. The woods were never this quiet. No wind, no rustling, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. By the time we reached the house, Chester stepped inside without hesitation and curled up on his bed. He didn't shake off the dirt like he usually did. He didn't sniff around for food. He just laid down, stiff as a rock, eyes open but unfocused. I stood there waiting, expecting him to snap out of it. But he didn't. He didn't move for a long time, just breathing slow and steady, staring at nothing. Something had happened out there. I didn't know what, and Chester couldn't tell me. But whatever it was, it had changed him. And as I stood in the doorway, staring back toward the dark line of trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, whatever had made that light, whatever had taken my dog for those few minutes, was still out there watching. Camping had always seemed like a good way to break from routine, to sit under the open sky, breathe in the fresh air, and step away from the constant hum of modern life. A few years back, I joined a large group for a camping trip. There were about 45 of us in total, spread across a well-known campground. It was a busy weekend, and by the time the two girls I was sharing a tent with and I arrived, the main site was packed. There wasn't enough space left for us, so we had to set up across the road near the river. It wasn't ideal, being separated from the rest of the group, but it was quiet, and the sound of the river in the background made the spot feel peaceful. At least it did during the day. The first night passed without much trouble. We cooked over the fire, talked for a while, then eventually crawled into our tent, zipping up inside our sleeping bags. The cold settled in, but it wasn't unbearable. I listened to the water rushing nearby, the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. Just animals moving about, nothing alarming. I fell asleep easily, barely waking when the wind picked up in the early hours. The second night, everything changed. I was deep asleep when something startled me awake. A sound, faint at first, just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe the wind, maybe an animal moving through the brush. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of movement just outside the thin fabric separating us from the woods. I froze. It wasn't the careful rustling of a rabbit or the quiet steps of a deer. It was heavier, deliberate, more than one set of feet shifting around. My heart pounded. The river masked a lot of outside noise, but even over the sound of the rushing water, I could hear breathing. Low, steady breathing, followed by a sudden growl. Not a dog's growl, not anything small. It was deep, guttural, the kind of sound that cuts straight through your body and locks your muscles in place. A sound I recognized instantly as a cougar. My first instinct was to reach for something, anything, to protect us, but I had nothing. No gun, no knife. My knife was in the car, uselessly tucked away in the glove compartment. All I had were my hands, and those wouldn't do much against a predator with sharp claws and fangs. My mind raced through everything I knew about cougars. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Stand your ground if it comes at you. None of it felt useful when I was trapped inside a thin nylon tent, unable to even see what was out there. I turned to wake one of the girls sleeping beside me, the one closest. I knew the other girl wouldn't handle the situation well. She was already nervous about camping this far from the main group. I nudged my friend, and as soon as she stirred, I whispered that there was something outside. She tensed immediately, and I knew she had heard it too. We both stayed frozen in place, listening. The breathing, the shifting, the occasional low growl that made my skin crawl. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time stretched in that awful way it does when fear takes over. Every second felt like an hour. My hands were shaking, my breathing shallow. I thought about yelling, about making noise to scare them off. But if they didn't leave, I knew we'd be in real trouble. We sat there, silent, our bodies rigid. The sounds continued, circling the tent. The fabric shifted slightly as something brushed against it. I could barely breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated. The growling faded. The night fell silent again, save for the river. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. My friend did too. Neither of us moved. Neither of us dared to step outside. At some point, exhaustion took over and the other girl in the tent shifted in her sleep, unaware of the hellish night she had just slept through. Morning came, And as soon as the first light crept through the fabric of our tent, I crawled out, every nerve still on edge. The ground outside was undisturbed. No prints, no signs of an animal moving around. It was strange, but I was too shaken to think much of it. My friend followed me out, and we just stood there, looking at each other, still processing the night. When we finally made our way back across the road to the main campground, we told a few people what had happened. That's when someone laughed and shook their head. Turned out there were no cougars, no wild animals lurking outside our tent, no predators stalking us in the dark. It had been two guys from our own group, grown men, both in their 30s, deciding it would be funny to sneak over to our tent in the middle of the night and scare us by making animal noises and creeping around like predators. They thought it was hilarious, just a joke, just messing around. I felt sick. I had spent hours in a state of sheer panic, preparing for the very real possibility of fighting for my life, and it had all been a joke to them. My heart had pounded so hard I thought it would explode. My body had been locked in terror for what felt like an eternity, and they had just been playing around. I looked at them, laughing, shaking their heads like we had overreacted, and something inside me just shut off. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I didn't even respond. I just felt cold, numb. I packed my things in silence that morning. I sat by the fire with the others, but I barely spoke. The rest of the trip felt different, tainted by what had happened. I tried to shake it off, to push it to the back of my mind, but I couldn't. The fear had been too real, too raw. And worst of all, I had learned something I could never unlearn. I wasn't safe. Not really. Not out here, not anywhere. I didn't say goodbye when I left. I just threw my bag into my car, got behind the wheel, and drove away. I haven't gone camping since, and I never will again. We set out in the early afternoon, my car packed with supplies, the back seat crowded with sleeping bags, coolers, and backpacks. The plan was simple: drive out to a well-known campground deep in the forest, set up, and spend a few days away from everything. No phones, no internet, just nature. It had been a while since all of us had camped together, and we were looking forward to it. When we arrived, though, the campground was full. Cars lined the dirt parking lot, and families had already set up tents in every available space. The park ranger told us we were out of luck unless someone left early, but that wasn't likely. We stood around for a while, debating our next move. We had driven hours to get here, and none of us wanted to turn around. One of my friends suggested we just drive further into the forest and set up our own camp somewhere more remote. It wasn't technically allowed, but we knew how to follow leave no trace rules, and we'd be careful. After a bit of hesitation, we all agreed. It wasn't the first time we had camped outside designated areas, and honestly, the idea of being completely alone in the woods sounded even better than staying at a crowded campground. We drove for miles down a narrow dirt road, the trees growing denser as we went. There were no other cars, no signs of people. Eventually, we found a clearing just big enough to set up camp. A small stream ran nearby, and there was plenty of dry wood for a fire. It felt perfect, secluded, quiet, peaceful. We spent the rest of the day setting up camp, pitching our tents in a rough circle around the fire pit. As the sun started to set, we cooked dinner over the fire, talking and laughing, the warmth of the flames keeping the night chill at bay. The forest around us was silent, apart from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. At some point, we all crawled into our tents and drifted off to sleep. Then, at around 2 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The air was still, the forest quiet. Then I heard it, drumming. Soft at first, just a distant thump, 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 like something carried on the wind. Then it grew louder, a steady, rhythmic beat, accompanied by singing. Not just one voice, but several, blending together in a chant that I couldn't understand. Sounded old, ancient, almost. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't the only one awake. I could hear the others shifting in their tents, no one saying a word. The music wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around us, as if the trees themselves were carrying the sound. The feeling that washed over me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not fear exactly, but something worse. A deep, bone-level certainty that we were not supposed to be here, that something was very, very wrong. I don't know how long we lay there, listening. The music didn't stop. It just continued, steady and unbroken. The voices rising and falling with the beat of the drums. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and crawled out. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the campsite. The others were emerging from their tents too, eyes wide, faces pale in the dim light. No one spoke. We didn't have to. We all felt it. Without a word, we grabbed our sleeping bags and moved to the car. No one argued, no one hesitated. We piled inside, locking the doors. The music didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, the forest was silent again. Birds chirped, the wind rustled through the leaves. Everything was normal. But the feeling from the night before still lingered, a weight in the back of my mind. We spent most of the day trying to figure out where the music could have come from. We hiked around the area, looking for any sign of other campers. There was nothing. No footprints, no tents, no campfires. The forest was undisturbed, as if no one had been there but us. That night, we decided to stay. Maybe it had been some weird acoustic phenomenon, or maybe there had been a group of campers nearby that we just hadn't seen. We didn't want to let fear chase us away. At 2 in the morning, the music started again. This time, it was louder, closer. The drumming felt heavier, the singing more intense. And the feeling, that deep, gut-wrenching certainty that something was wrong, was even stronger. None of us spoke. We just sat in the tent, wide-eyed and silent, listening. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get up and run, but I didn't move. I don't think any of us did. We stayed awake all night. The music never stopped, not until the first light of dawn. That morning, none of us even discussed it. We just packed up camp in silence, stuffing our gear into bags, rolling up our tents as fast as we could. We drove straight back to the original campground. By some miracle, a spot had opened up. That night, as we lay in our tents, surrounded by other campers, the world felt normal again. There was no music, no drumming, just the soft hum of crickets, the distant crackling of campfires. To this day, I don't have an explanation. We weren't on tribal land. We never saw another soul out there. And yet, for 2 nights, the forest had been filled with voices and drums. Maybe it was just something natural, something our minds twisted into something bigger. But deep down, I don't think so. I don't think we were supposed to be there. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I thought it would be one of those things I'd look back on and laugh about. But by the time I was deep into those woods, with nothing but the dim glow of my flashlight and the sound of my own footsteps, I regretted everything. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip. I had done group trips before, but never alone. There was something about the idea that appealed to me. The challenge, the solitude, the chance to disconnect. I picked a location that seemed remote but manageable. A stretch of dense forest about 20 miles from the nearest town. There was a lake nearby, an old logging trail leading in, and from what I read online, hardly anyone went out there anymore. I parked my car at the edge of the forest, right where the dirt road ended. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started walking. The first part of the trail was easy, a wide, flat path that used to be used for logging decades ago. It smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Birds chirped somewhere high in the canopy, and every so often, I'd hear the distant rustling of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. After about an hour, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, completely still, like a sheet of black glass reflecting the sky. No houses, no boats, no signs of human presence at all. Just me, the water, and the trees pressing in around it. I found a clearing a few yards back from the shoreline and set up camp. The ground was a little uneven, but it would do. I got a fire going, boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal, and sat back, letting the warmth soak into my skin as the temperature started to drop. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. I should have left the next morning. I woke up to silence. Not just the normal quiet of the forest, but a deep, heavy stillness that felt unnatural. No birds, no wind rustling the trees, just the faint lapping of water against the shore. I checked my watch, 6:13 a.m. The sky was still gray with early morning light, the air damp and cold. Something had changed overnight. I stepped out of my tent and scanned the tree line. Nothing, just trees standing still like they were holding their breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to the kind of silence that came with being truly alone. I shook it off, made some instant coffee, and went about my morning. By mid-afternoon, I decided to hike a little deeper into the woods. I marked my campsite with a piece of bright orange tape on a tree and set out with just a small pack, water, a knife, some snacks, and my flashlight. I followed an old deer trail, winding through thick underbrush and past massive, moss-covered rocks. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out most of the light. About 2 miles in, I found something strange. A tree stripped bare. Its bark had been clawed away in long, deep gouges, exposing the pale wood beneath. The marks were fresh. I crouched down, running my fingers along the grooves. They were too wide for a bear, too deliberate. Something had done this recently. I stood up, suddenly aware of how far I was from my campsite. The stillness pressed in again, thicker this time, like the forest was waiting for something. I decided to turn back. That's when I heard it. A crunch. Not a small twig snapping, not the rustling of a bird moving through the leaves. A deep, deliberate crunch, like something heavy shifting its weight on the forest floor. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The sound had come from behind me, just beyond the trees. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the woods. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then, another crunch, closer this time. I didn't wait. I started walking, keeping my steps light and quick. I wasn't running, not yet, but my body was screaming at me to move faster. The trees blurred past, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Then the sound came again. Not behind me this time. Beside me, something was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. The slow, steady footsteps, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. It wasn't an animal. It was too controlled, too precise. I sped up. My campsite wasn't far. I just needed to make it back. The footsteps stayed with me, not chasing, just following. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I reached my campsite and turned around, expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The silence had returned, thick and suffocating. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent, my knife clutched in my hand, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of splashing. The lake. Something was moving in the water. I sat up, my heart hammering. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The moon was high now, casting a pale glow over the lake. The water rippled. Slow, deliberate movements like something was waiting just below the surface. Then the ripples stopped. The silence stretched on. My breath felt too loud. Then, just as I was about to back away, something stepped out of the water. A shape, tall, unmoving. It stood at the edge of the lake, water streaming off its body, its head tilted slightly like it was listening. I didn't breathe. It didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned and walked back into the trees. I packed my gear before the sun was even up. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even put out my fire properly. I just grabbed everything and started moving, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every noise made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. When I finally reached the tree line, I almost cried with relief. My car was still there, sitting exactly where I left it. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Only when I was miles away, speeding down the empty road, did I start to feel like I could breathe again. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But I never went camping alone again. It had been a long day. The kind of day where I just wanted to put in my headphones, drown everything out, and make my way home without having to interact with a single soul. I had left school later than usual, and the weight of the day sat heavily on my shoulders. My playlist was turned up loud enough that I could barely hear anything around me, which was exactly how I liked it. The world blurred into the background as I walked along the familiar route home. I was dressed in one of my usual outfits, a skirt with shorts underneath, stockings, and a shirt that didn't really matter much in this story. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary for me, but I always felt confident in my choice of clothes. As I walked, I was in my own little world, humming slightly to the music, barely paying attention to anything else. That was until I felt something. It was subtle at first, just the faintest brush of something against me. I thought maybe I had walked too close to a bush, or maybe a bag had swung from someone passing by. I ignored it, pushing it to the back of my mind, but not for long. A few moments later, I felt it again. It wasn't forceful, but it was deliberate. This time, a small breeze hit my legs, making the hairs on my skin rise. Something wasn't right. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see behind me without making it obvious. My stomach dropped. There was a man walking way too close for it to be normal. My breath hitched in my throat as my mind scrambled to process what was happening. He was inches away, his eyes locked on me, and the realization of just how close he had been to me in that moment made my skin crawl. I did the only thing my body knew to do. I screamed. It wasn't a loud, dramatic scream, but it was enough to startle both of us. He jumped, looking flustered, and immediately walked in front of me, speeding away like he had somewhere to be. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. I told myself maybe it was nothing, maybe he hadn't meant to be that close, maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. I took my time getting home. I needed to calm down. I stopped at a gas station, lingered at a park bench for a while, scrolled through my phone, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled into my bones. By the time I finally reached my apartment complex, the sun had started to dip lower in the sky. I was exhausted and just wanted to lock myself in my room and forget about everything. That was when I noticed him. First, I didn't think much of it. Just some guy in a hoodie and basketball shorts standing near the stairway leading up to my apartment. Maybe a new neighbor, maybe waiting for someone. But the moment I approached, he moved. Not away, not randomly, directly underneath my staircase. The stairs leading up to my apartment weren't solid. They had gaps between them, just big enough for someone underneath to look up and see whoever was climbing them. My stomach twisted as the pieces started to click together. I had stopped in my tracks, watching him, and he was watching me. No, not watching me, watching up. I could feel the weight of his eyes locked on my skirt. My blood ran cold, but I had worn shorts. If he was hoping to see something, he was going to be disappointed. Still, the smugness I felt in that moment was nothing compared to the terror that gripped me when I saw what he did next. He pulled out his phone. I could see the screen glow faintly in the dimming light. He was trying to take pictures. My breath caught in my throat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to unlock my front door, but the damn thing wouldn't work. The electronic lock on my door connected to my phone, and for whatever reason, it wasn't registering. I was stuck. I couldn't get into my apartment, and I couldn't go back down the stairs because he was right there. Panic was creeping into my chest, squeezing my lungs, making it hard to think. I forced myself to glance down through the gaps in the stairs. He was still there, and then the worst thing happened. I saw him pull his shorts down. My brain refused to process what I was seeing at first. It wasn't real, couldn't be real, but it was. His hand moved, and I felt my stomach twist into a violent knot. My body was frozen, locked in place by a terror I had never known before. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt stuck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. Somehow, I managed to call my dad. I couldn't even think straight enough to dial the police, but my dad knew exactly what to do. He told me to stay put and called them for me. I slid down against my door, my body trembling, trying to keep myself out of sight while I waited. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him to leave, but I didn't know what kind of person he was. I didn't know if he was dangerous. If I provoked him, would he get aggressive? I had to do something. I took a deep breath, gathering whatever courage I had left, and made a run for it. I bolted down the stairs, sprinting as fast as my legs could carry me towards the apartment complex's community office. I didn't dare look back. My only goal was to get somewhere safe, somewhere with other people. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my lungs burning. By the time I reached the office, I felt like I was going to collapse. I looked back. He was gone. Relief flooded my body, but the fear was still there, clawing at the edges of my mind. I didn't feel safe, not even in my own home. When I finally got back, my dad had unlocked the door remotely. I locked myself inside, shaking, waiting for the police to show up. When they arrived, they asked me questions, took down all the details. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I knew how these things went. The guy was gone. He wasn't some known criminal, just some random pervert who had probably done this before and would probably do it again. And that was the worst part. Not knowing if I'd ever see him again. Not knowing if he was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting for another opportunity. I never saw him after that night. I don't know if he ever came back. But for weeks, months even, I never felt at ease. Every time I walked home, I checked over my shoulder. Every time I climbed those stairs, I glanced down, making sure no one was there. And even now, I still do, because you never know who might be watching. New Mexico was dry, hot, and stretched out in endless miles of open land, cut through by the occasional trail. It was a beautiful place, but not forgiving. I had been hiking most of the day, following a worn dirt path that snaked between low shrubs and patches of grass. The sun was relentless, beating down, drying sweat before it had the chance to settle. My canteen had enough water, but I could feel the thirst creeping in already, the kind that builds up in the back of your throat. At some point, I needed to piss. I stepped off the trail into a patch of tall grass, just a few steps away from the open dirt. The moment I unzipped and let go, the sound hit me. Sharp, distinct, immediate, a rattling right at my feet, the kind of sound that stops everything. My brain took a second to catch up. Then it clicked. I was pissing on a rattlesnake. The next second was a blur of movement, panic overriding everything else. I bolted, midstream, not caring where I was aiming anymore. The dry ground turned into a mess of wet dirt behind me as I ran, legs working on pure instinct. The feeling of pissing myself barely registered compared to the sheer horror of what I had just done. I stumbled back onto the trail, breath heaving, heart hammering against my ribs. The snake was still coiled where I had left it, half hidden in the grass, tail shaking in warning. I had been seconds from stepping right onto it. The next few hours were miserable, walking in the heat with piss-soaked pants. But I was alive. I take that trade. That wasn't the only thing that rattled me on the trip. The nights were worse. At camp, after the fire burned low and the last murmurs of conversation faded, the world sank into silence. A kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else, thick and pressing, where even the smallest rustle feels like an alarm going off in the dark. I shared a tent with a guy who had been fine most of the trip, until one night, well past midnight, when I woke up to screaming. Not just any scream. A full-throated, blood-curdling, gut-wrenching scream that shattered the silence like glass breaking. My body jolted upright before I was even fully awake, heart slamming against my ribs. My tent mate sat there, eyes closed, mouth open, letting out a wail that felt like it didn't belong to anything human. Every hair on my body stood up. I didn't move, barely breathed, just sat there frozen, listening. And then, Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence slammed down like a fist. He slumped back down into his sleeping bag. I waited, heart still hammering, watching for any sign that he was awake. Nothing, just slow, even breathing, sleep talking, or rather sleep screaming. I barely slept the rest of the night. Then there were the bears. Up in Denali, the land felt untouched, immense, indifferent. The campsite had an old one-room cabin, used by fishermen during the season. Inside, there was a logbook, a collection of past campers' notes, stories, scribbled memories left behind. We flipped through it, reading in the dim light of our headlamps. Most of it was harmless, weather notes, fishing reports, the occasional crude joke. Then we found the entry. A grizzly was in camp 2 days ago. Be careful. That was all it said. Short, direct, unsettling. I had seen grizzlies before, but always from a safe distance. Knowing one had been here, wandering between the trees, sniffing around camp, that was different. Every sound outside the tent that night felt sharper, closer. The wind through the trees became something bigger moving. The creak of a branch turned into a footstep. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, waiting, listening. Sleep was hard to come by. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. High country camping always carried that tension. The what-ifs, the second-guessing. You go over everything in your head before bed. Did I store my food right? Is my deodorant strong enough to attract attention? Did I touch something earlier that might still carry a scent? That paranoia builds until every noise outside becomes a potential threat. Once, in the dead of night, I felt it. Something pressed against the side of the tent. It was light, just a nudge, but it was there. I stopped breathing. My body locked up, every muscle frozen in place. The fabric of the tent shifted, pushing inward slightly before pulling back. I didn't move, couldn't move. My mind ran through every possibility. The grizzly, a smaller bear, something else entirely. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all after that. But even that fear, the fear of something tangible, something you know is real, doesn't compare to the other feeling. The one that comes when you realize something is watching you, and you don't know what it is. There are places in the wild where the air shifts, where something settles deep in your gut that tells you you are not alone. It isn't a bear or a mountain lion or anything you can explain. It's something else, something older, something worse. I felt it once. Sitting by the fire, the night stretched wide and endless around me. 1 second, everything was fine. The next, it wasn't. The feeling dropped over me like a stone. Heavy, unshakable. The hairs on my arms stood up. The fire flickered, but that wasn't it. It wasn't the wind, or the dark, or any sound I could name. It was just there, pressing in, coiling tight in my chest. A wrongness in the air itself. I didn't wait. I didn't try to explain it. I stood up, put out the fire, and went to my tent. My hands shook as I zipped it closed. Inside, in the thin fabric shelter, I still felt it. I lay there, eyes open, waiting, listening. Nothing happened. But I swear to this day something was out there watching, and I don't ever want to know what it was. We arrived at the campground on a bright and unseasonably warm Friday afternoon. The early autumn air thick and still, carrying the scent of dried leaves and damp earth. My husband pulled our rented RV into the designated spot, maneuvering it between the towering oak trees that lined the clearing. We had decided to splurge this year, avoiding the communal bunkhouses in favor of a bit of privacy and comfort, especially for the kids. The weekend passed in a blur of scheduled activities, shared meals, and the constant hum of voices. The girls spent most of their time running between the lake and the playground, only coming back to the camper for food and sleep. We barely noticed the camper itself aside from a place to retreat when the sun dipped below the treetops. We were happy to have the air conditioning, though. The heat clung even after dark, wrapping around us like a thick blanket, making the evenings feel restless and heavy. Sunday afternoon, the retreat officially ended. Families packed up their belongings, hugging each other goodbye before loading up their cars and heading down the long, winding road that led back to town. We, however, still had the RV until Monday morning. That was when we noticed the smell. By 6 o'clock, the air inside the camper had turned foul, a sickly sweet stench that made the back of my throat burn. My husband traced it to the septic system, realizing too late that the previous renters hadn't cleared the lines before returning it. The system had backed up, the toilet barely usable, the smell growing worse by the minute. Worried that the rental company would blame us, my husband decided to drive into the next town over to pick up some drain cleaner. It was a small, rural area, and the only place open that late on a Sunday was a Walmart nearly 40 minutes away. He promised to be back as quickly as possible and disappeared into the night, his taillights shrinking as he followed the winding dirt road out of the campground. I stayed behind with our daughters, making sure they were settled for the night. They were exhausted from the weekend, their energy finally spent. I tidied the space, stowing away the last of our things, wiping down the countertops, locking the door. The campground was eerily quiet now. Only a few other families had stayed behind, their campers scattered across the empty field. I hadn't realized how unsettling the silence could be until I was alone with it. After making sure the girls had water, I tucked myself into bed with a book. The quiet stretched on, the pages rustling in the dim light. The occasional creak of the camper settling was the only sound aside from the chirping of insects outside. I checked my phone, watching the minutes tick by. My husband had been gone for nearly 40 minutes. He'd be back soon. Then I heard it. A clicking sound, light and rhythmic, coming from the window just above the bed. I stopped reading instantly, my ears straining against the silence. I ran through all the logical explanations. The wind, the branches, some small animal, the air conditioning kicking on. But the air conditioner wasn't running. I sat up slowly, heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath and listened. Another click, and then another. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, placing my feet lightly on the floor. The sound came again, shifting slightly, following me as I moved. I hesitated before stepping into the narrow kitchen, reaching blindly for the knife I had left on the counter after dinner. My fingers curled around the handle, my grip tight. The sound stopped. I stood frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then, suddenly, the door handle rattled. I sucked in a sharp breath. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. The camper had two locks, the main handle lock and a deadbolt. I knew I had locked them both, but that sound, the soft scrape of metal against metal, made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, retreating toward the loft bed over the driver's seat. The girls were sleeping just a few feet away in the rear bunk, oblivious. I crouched low, watching the door from the shadows. The knife felt small and useless in my hands, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My phone. I fumbled with it, trying to get a signal. Nothing. The bar flickered, searching, but no connection would come through. I stayed there, motionless, my mind racing through every possibility. An animal wouldn't rattle the handle like that. Person would. A person who thought we were alone. A person who wasn't expecting me to be awake. The minutes dragged. I could hear the distant sound of crickets and the rustling of trees. But outside the camper, there was only silence. No footsteps, no movement, just waiting. Then, finally, a sliver of light through the small side window. Headlights. My husband's truck winding its way up the dirt road. I didn't move until I heard the truck door slam. Only then did I shift, rising slowly, my hands trembling as I gripped the knife. The door swung open, and my husband stepped inside, his expression shifting when he saw me standing there, the knife clutched in my hand. He dismissed my fear easily, laughing, calling me paranoid. He checked the locks, shrugged, and assured me that no one had been out there. He had seen no one on the road, no signs of any movement nearby. I barely slept that night. Morning came, bringing the relief of daylight. We packed quickly, eager to be rid of the foul-smelling camper and back in our own home. The drive to the rental facility was uneventful. Then the manager came out, walking the perimeter of the RV, clipboard in hand. My husband and I waited, exhausted, anxious to get home. Then he stopped. He turned toward us, frowning. "Do you know what happened to the rear window?" I stepped forward, my stomach lurching. He gestured toward the back of the camper, where the master bed had been. I moved closer and felt my knees go weak. The gasket around the window had been cut clean through, removed carefully with a blade. Deep gashes marked the paint, the metal scored with thin, deliberate cuts. The lock had been tampered with, a screwdriver or knife jammed into the frame, scratching the surface where someone had tried to force it open. Someone had tried to get in, and I had been lying right there. The rental company didn't charge us for the damage. We drove home in silence, the girls oblivious in the back seat. I never consented to another solo camping trip after that. I refused to stay anywhere isolated, refused to let my husband leave me alone in the middle of nowhere again. I still don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't know why they left. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that clicking sound, and I wonder how close they got before they gave up. I used to camp all the time when I was a kid. It was second nature to me. Packing up my gear, picking a spot in the woods, settling in for a night under the stars. But life got in the way. I moved away from the mountains, got caught up in work and responsibilities, and somehow 10 years passed without me spending a single night in the wild. I told myself I hadn't lost my edge, but a decade is a long time. I wasn't the same kid who ran through the trees without a second thought. When I finally decided to go on a solo trip, I didn't pick some well-known campsite or an easy access spot. That wasn't my style. I wanted to be alone, out where I could breathe in the quiet and hear nothing but the wind in the trees. It was a long drive to where I planned to camp, and I'd gotten a later start than I wanted. The sun was sinking lower than I was comfortable with, so I pulled off on a national forest back road, figuring I'd just sleep in the truck for the night. I'd find a better campsite in the morning. The spot wasn't perfect, but it would do. It was off any main roads, well away from any traffic. A small creek ran nearby, barely visible through the trees. The ground was thick with years of fallen pine needles, giving everything a soft, muted feel. It smelled like earth and sap, that deep, clean scent that I'd missed so much. I was setting up my sleeping bag in the back of the truck, stuffing my air mattress into the cab, getting everything ready for the night. The light was fading fast, turning the sky into that deep blue that comes right before full dark. That's when I noticed it. Silence. The woods were dead quiet. If you've spent enough time in the wilderness, you know how unnatural that is. There's always noise. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of a bird, the hum of insects. But here there was nothing. No wind, no movement, just the creeping dark pressing in from the trees. I stood still, straining to listen, and that's when I heard it. A sharp, urgent call, a Steller's jay. If you don't know birds, they're part of the corvid family, along with crows and ravens. And corvids don't call for no reason. They alert to predators. My stomach tightened. I turned my head toward the sound, eyes scanning the tree line. First, I saw nothing, then movement. Something passed between two trees, way too close for comfort. I didn't see the whole thing, just the top of its hindquarters moving through the brush. Tawny-colored. My brain tried to rationalize it. Deer, I thought. It had to be a deer. But then it hit me. There was no sound. The ground was covered in thick layers of pine needles and leaves. Anything walking through it would make noise. Deer crunch when they move. They snap twigs, rustle underbrush. This thing had moved completely silent. Only predators move that way. The realization sent a slow, cold wave through my chest. I knew what it was. A mountain lion. I'd heard stories of them, read accounts of people catching glimpses, feeling watched, sometimes even being stalked without ever seeing the cat itself. They're ambush hunters, built for stealth, masters of patience. I looked toward the creek, trying to calm myself with logic. If it kept moving in that direction, it would have to cross the water. I'd see it when it left. But the minutes passed, and it never crossed. That meant one thing. It had stopped. I was being watched. My hands felt clumsy as I hurried to unroll my sleeping bag. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to get inside the truck, to put something solid between me and whatever was out there. My breathing was too loud in the silence. The J had gone quiet now too, which somehow made it worse. I kept my eyes on the trees, trying not to turn my back as I shoved my gear into the truck bed. My fingers fumbled with the tailgate latch, and when I finally got it closed, I slammed it as hard as I could. The noise shattered the silence, echoing off the trees. Then I heard it. 3 heavy bounds, fast and powerful, crashing through the brush. Then silence again. It hadn't gone far. My body felt like it wasn't mine as I yanked open the door and climbed into the truck, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking. My breath was too fast. I forced myself to stay still, listening, watching. Nothing. Minutes passed. The light faded completely. The truck cab felt too small, the windows too thin. I imagined yellow eyes watching me from the dark, muscles coiled, waiting. Mountain lions are patient. They don't give up easy. I stayed awake as long as I could, gripping the handle of my knife, listening. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke to the first hints of dawn, the sky turning gray. I let out a slow breath, waiting for the stiffness to leave my limbs before I dared to open the door. The forest felt different in the morning, less haunted. The normal sounds had returned, birds chirping, the distant rustle of small animals moving in the brush. I stepped out, my boots crunching against the ground, and walked toward the spot where I'd seen the cat. Tracks, large paw prints pressed into the soft earth, moving in a slow, deliberate line. They hadn't gone toward the creek after all. They had circled my truck. I stared at them for a long time. It had been watching me, judging, deciding. I wasn't worth the trouble, apparently. I exhaled, slow and controlled, and turned back to the truck. I wasn't about to stick around. I packed up fast and got back on the road, driving out of the forest with the windows down, breathing in the cold morning air. That wasn't my last solo trip. It didn't scare me away from the woods, but I learned something that night, something I hadn't quite understood before. The wild doesn't belong to us. We walk through it, but we are not in control. We are not at the top of the food chain. And sometimes, when we least expect it, something out there reminds us of that fact. I worked at an outdoor sleepaway summer camp deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The camp itself was nestled between a dense forest and a wide, slow-moving river. The staff stayed in a cluster of cabins a short walk from the main camp, set back from the campers' lodgings for some privacy. It was my second summer there, and I had gotten used to the usual sounds of the forest at night. The distant howls of coyotes, the rustling of deer moving through the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. But there are some sounds that don't fit, sounds that don't belong. That night, we had a late staff meeting in the main lodge. The campers had been put to bed hours before, and most of the staff were there, tired but listening as the camp director went over the usual business. Schedule changes, reminders, safety updates. It had been a long day, and I found myself staring at the dim lantern light flickering against the wooden walls, half zoned out, waiting for the meeting to end so I could get some sleep. Then we heard it. A sound drifted in from the woods, faint at first, barely registering. A high, quivering wail. I wasn't the only one who looked up. It sounded distant, but it carried. Came again, louder this time. A sharp, keening cry that sent a shiver up my spine. It sounded like a baby deep in the woods, far from any of the campers' cabins. The room had gone quiet. Every person there had spent enough time in those woods to know that nothing good came from noises like that. But there was also a responsibility that came with working at camp. We were responsible for every single kid, and if there was any chance, however small, that a child was out there, lost in the dark, we had to check. 3 of us volunteered. Me, Alex, and Jonah. We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods, leaving the rest of the staff behind in the lodge. The sound had stopped, and the forest had gone still. No wind, no usual night sounds, just silence. The kind of silence that presses in heavy and unnatural. Our flashlights cut through the darkness as we made our way along one of the narrow trails leading toward the stream that ran through camp. The woods were thick, the trees packed close together, their trunks casting long shadows. The dirt path beneath our feet was uneven, twisted with roots and rocks. I felt my pulse in my ears as we moved deeper in. Then the sound came again. A shrill, piercing cry, close this time. Too close. My stomach tightened as the beam of my flashlight caught movement ahead, just at the edge of the stream. A small shape writhing on the bank. It was a rabbit, a dying rabbit. The poor thing was torn open, its body heaving, blood seeping into the dirt and washing into the stream. I froze, staring at it, my mind struggling to process what I was looking at. The noise, the awful wailing noise, it had been coming from this. I had never heard a rabbit scream before, and I never wanted to again. Jonah swore under his breath. Alex muttered something about a fox, how it must have been hunting and left the job unfinished. It made sense. Foxes were common enough around here, and we'd found the remains of their meals before. But this was different. The rabbit was still alive, barely, its chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Its eyes were wide and glassy, its body twitching. Alex stepped forward. He said we should head back, that he would stay and put it out of its misery. It was the humane thing to do. We hesitated, but in the end, we nodded and turned back toward camp, leaving him behind. We were almost to the staff cabins when we heard running footsteps pounding the dirt behind us. We turned just in time to see Alex barreling toward us, his face twisted in pure terror. He was covered in blood, his arms, his chest, even his face. Not his blood, the rabbit's, but it was his expression that scared me the most. He didn't stop. He didn't say a word. He just ran past us, sprinting straight for the staff house. We caught up with him just as he threw himself through the door, panting, wild-eyed. The meeting had just ended, and the other staff members were still milling around, talking. They all turned, startled, as Alex doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. Took a second for him to get the words out. When he did, they didn't seem real. It wasn't a fox. It was a cougar, a big one. It had been there, watching, waiting. The moment Alex raised the rock to put the rabbit out of its misery, it moved. He hadn't even heard it until it was almost on top of him. He had only one option. He threw the rabbit at it and ran. The camp went into immediate lockdown. The director got on the radio, calling in every available wildlife ranger. Campers were woken up, moved to the center of camp, and told to stay inside with their counselors. The floodlights were turned on, casting the camp in a harsh, artificial glow. For hours, we waited. Rangers arrived, armed and ready, combing the woods. They found tracks, fresh ones. The cougar had been close, too close, but by then, it was long gone, melted back into the forest. By morning, the rangers gave the all clear, but the warning was clear: be careful. Be alert. Cougars don't usually attack people, but this one had lingered, had watched, had waited, and that wasn't normal. The rest of the summer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I walked those trails alone. I never heard that sound again, the awful, shrill cry that had led us into the woods that night. But I'll never forget it. Dying rabbits sound like crying babies, and sometimes what's hunting them is hunting something bigger. When I was a kid, I lived near a state park. It wasn't the kind of untouched wilderness you'd think of when you hear the words state park. It was one of those places that had been absorbed by the edge of a city, a green patch carved into the outskirts, so overhiked and busy that it felt more like an outdoor gym than a refuge for wildlife. Trails crisscrossed through the trees, and it was impossible to go even a minute without passing other people. Joggers, dog walkers, families with loud kids, teenagers sneaking off to do things they weren't supposed to. Felt safe, predictable, and tamed. The land stretched on for miles, leading eventually into a vast mountainous region. But that was far beyond where most people ventured. Closer to home, The biggest animal I had ever seen was a squirrel. Rumors floated around about wild pigs, but most people dismissed them as exaggerations. The most dangerous things were rattlesnakes, and even they wanted nothing to do with people. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected to come across anything bigger than a rabbit. That's what made the first time I saw the deer so strange. It was a late summer afternoon, the air dry and warm, when my dad and I took one of the less used trails. It wasn't a secret path or anything like that, but it was rougher, steeper in places, and not suitable for bikes. Fewer people meant a greater chance of stumbling upon a rattlesnake, so I kept my eyes on the ground, watching where I stepped. My dad was ahead of me, moving carefully but confidently. Then he stopped suddenly. "Oh shit!" he muttered under his breath. I looked up, expecting to see a snake coiled in the dirt, but what I saw instead made my heart skip a beat. Two enormous bucks stood not 20 feet from us. Their antlers were massive, taller, and wider than I would have thought possible. They were thick-bodied, their coats sleek and healthy, and they stood so still they might have been statues. I had never seen deer this big, not in real life. Excited, I blurted out, "Oh dear," and took a step forward. "Sedina, no," my dad barked, but I barely heard him. I wasn't scared. I was thrilled. They were so close, and one of them had lowered its head, like it was inviting me forward. In my child's mind, I thought it wanted to be petted. My dad's sudden movement snapped me out of my trance. He was frantically looking around, later telling me he had been searching for a tree he could throw me into if things went south. Before I could take another step, he hurled a branch at the buck's face. The stick struck it right across the snout, and though the second deer took off immediately, the one closest to me barely flinched. My dad swore, gripping my arm tight, and for a few long seconds, the deer just stared at us. Then, as if it had lost interest, it pranced away, disappearing into the brush like nothing had happened. My dad was livid, and once he was sure the deer was gone, he gave me a very serious talk about how even nice animals can be dangerous. He explained how bucks could gore people, how they fought each other, how the lowered head hadn't been an invitation, it had been a warning. I had been inches away from something that could have killed me, and I hadn't even realized it. That was the first time I felt like the park wasn't as predictable as I had believed. That fall, a mountain lion was spotted from one of the busiest trails. It wasn't close, just a shadow in the distance, but it was the first sighting in decades. People whispered about it, but most weren't too concerned. It had probably wandered down from the mountains, gotten lost, and would be gone soon enough. It wasn't until years later that we realized what was really happening. The park wasn't just a city escape anymore. Conservation efforts were working, and the animals were coming back. By the time I was in my 20s, the change was undeniable. Deer were no longer a rare sight. They jumped into backyards, chewed up garden beds, and strolled through the picnic areas like they owned the place. Owls nested right next to the main parking lot, unfazed by the constant foot traffic. The wild pigs weren't just rumors anymore. They were real, and they were a problem. I heard stories of people seeing them near the trails, of them tearing up the ground, of their eerie grunting at night. The mountain lions, once a distant memory, made their presence known. You could hear them sometimes, their screams cutting through the darkness, sounding disturbingly human. It was an unsettling noise, one that stuck with you even after it had faded away. The rattlesnakes, for their part, remained as they always had, aloof, hidden, wanting nothing more than to be left alone. They hadn't changed. Everything else had. The park I had grown up with, the one that had felt so tame and safe, had transformed into something wilder. The animals had taken back their space, slowly but surely, until they were no longer guests but residents. The people, in turn, had to learn to be careful. Signs went up warning of aggressive deer. Trails were closed after pig sightings. People were reminded not to hike alone at dusk or dawn, not because of human threats, but because of the predators that had returned. It wasn't just a park anymore. It was wild again, and that, more than anything, was what made it feel truly alive.